Bring Your Own Yarn scarf is all about flexibility and fun. Whether you've got one special skein you've been saving or a huge pile of stash yarn, this pattern is going to work whatever yarn you bring to it. With no strict rules or tricky details, you get to decide the size, the style, and the look. Trust me when I say that this project is nearly impossible to get wrong, which makes it a perfect first Tunisian crochet pattern if you're new to this technique. In fact, you don't even need a Tunisian crochet hook to make the smallest size of the scarf. Hey there, I'm Jess for Make a New Crew, and welcome to the BYOY scarf tutorial. For the version I'm making on camera today, I'm using a yarn that's a collaboration between Bella Coco and Hobie. It's called Merino DK, and this yarn comes in a wide variety of colors. But if you're looking for a yarn that's extra smooth to crochet with and made with 100% natural fibers, this one is so nice. And part of the reason that it's so smooth to crochet with is because it has a chainette construction. So it's kind of woven like a little chain, and that makes it super smooth for the type of loops that we do in crocheting. Now, when I look at the yarn label for this yarn is called a category 2 yarn, but I find it very similar in weight to Lion Brand Kobu, which is called a category 3. All of this stuff is slightly variable based on the manufacturer. So what we're going to look at here today is actually what hook size is recommended for the yarn. So in this case, my yarn label says a 4.5 millimeter hook. That's a US size 7, which is not a size we often use in the US. So I'm going to focus on the millimeter. That's 4.5 millimeter. If I were to look at this Kobu right here, it suggests a G, which is a 4 millimeter hook, just slightly smaller than this one. So let's take this as our example here. I want to go up several hook sizes, and that is just something we do with Tunisian crochet to help combat the tendency Tunisian crochet has, and especially Tunisian simple stitch, which we're using here, it has a tendency to curl. So one of the ways that we combat that is using a much larger hook than we typically would for the yarn weight. So in this case, this is calling for a 4.5 millimeter hook, and I'm actually going to use a 6.5 millimeter hook. So I've jumped up 2 millimeters in the size hook that I'm using compared to what's suggested on the yarn label. Another one of the samples you'll see pictured was made with Lion Brand Heartland, and this yarn calls for a size J, which is a 6 millimeter hook. So again, we want to bump up significantly. This is a thicker yarn, it's a category 4. While it's asking for a size 6 millimeter, we're going to go up actually 3 sizes. That's what I did to make the sample that you see on camera. So this is actually a 9 millimeter hook. So the thicker your yarn gets, the more exaggerated hook size you want to use. If you were going to use a very chunky yarn, something like Hue and Me or Woolly's Thick and Quick, I would go up maybe even 4 millimeters in your hook size. I know it sounds insane, but it's really going to give you lovely drape and help your project curl a little less. Now let's talk about the type of hook you'll want to use. You maybe have seen something like this online. If you're totally new to Tunisian crochet, you may have felt intimidated by something like this, like I did when I first saw them. The other common type of Tunisian hook is something like this, where you're adding a cable to the end of it, and the length of the cable can vary depending on the number of stitches in your project. So if you have it in your budget to buy a set of cabled hooks like this is always what I like to use for Tunisian crochet, even if my project is a little narrower. So speaking of a narrow project, the scarf I'm going to make today on camera is going to be quite narrow. If you want to make a deeper scarf, meaning that the amount of fabric that goes from your chin down to your midsection, it's kind of a taller scarf. If you prefer that look, then you're going to want to have at least some amount of cable on your hook. So this one, the cable is only 15 inches, and this is what I used to make that green sample out of Heartland yarn. Another type of hook, same concept here. This is a wooden hook, and this just screws on like this. So I just wanted to show you what an even longer cable looks like if you were making something like a blanket or a really wide rectangular scarf. You might use something like this. The amazing thing though is that if you don't own any Tunisian crochet hooks, you can absolutely still make the version of the neckerchief I'm going to make on camera, because you can actually fit all of your stitches just on the crochet hook. So I am actually going to take that cable off and show you how we can use just a regular crochet hook. In this case, this is a Tunisian hook, but as you can see, you could use any crochet hook that has a a fairly even shaft. So you don't want one with a big chunky handle, of course, because the stitches are going to go on there. But what I like to do with any regular crochet hook, I just put a rubber band like this around the back end, and that's what's going to hold my stitches as I add them on this hook and as my project gets a little bit wider. All right, so that's gonna serve as my stopper right there, kind of like this would on this hook. Because my project is not going to be too deep, it's a pretty skinny little scarf, I'm gonna be able to fit all the stitches right on there, which also means that if you don't have any Tunisian hooks at home, you can follow along and make your own neckerchief using just the hooks that you have. You'll find the link to the full pattern right below this video, and while you're there, I wanna invite you to join our virtual crochet community. This is a super welcoming space filled with crocheters who lift each other up, and we answer each other's questions and of course show off our stitches. It is free to join and I would love to see you there. There is a really cool technique that is extremely simple that I'm going to show you in a minute. If you want to use 2 different colors or even many colors for your scarf, this allows you to create this cool woven look, and the opposite side looks like stripes. So you'll actually have a really beautiful reversible scarf if you choose to combine any 2 colors or even more in your scarf. And for this one, I'm just gonna get started with a solid color so that we can learn the ropes. To begin, I've got a slip knot on my hook, and we want 3 chains to get started. 1, 2, and 3. And then we're going to skip that first chain, insert our hook into the second chain, pull up a loop. So now I've got 2 loops on my hook, and then once again insert my hook in the third chain, pull up a loop. Now I've got 3 loops on my hook. So in Tunisian crochet, we call this our forward pass. Now we need to work back this direction with our return pass. So we start that with a chain 1, we just work through there. Again, I have 3 loops on my hook. Now I'm going to yarn over and pull through 2, yarn over and pull through 2. All right, I know that looks like nothing, but it's gonna grow very quickly. Since it can be pretty easy to lose track of where our last stitch is, I'm just gonna pop a stitch marker there. It'll also help us see it on camera, but it's a good idea to put a stitch marker where you did that chain 1 as we started our return pass, and that'll just help remind you where we're ending here. If you're an experienced Tunisian crocheter, you can probably skip that part. At this point, I have 3 stitches, 1, 2, and 3, and now I want to increase, and so that's going to happen twice in this row. I've already got this loop on my hook, so now I'm gonna work between my next 2 stitches. I've got this loop right here, then a bit of a space, and then another kind of upside down V. So I'm going to insert my hook right between that first stitch and second stitch and pull up a loop. So that's an increase now. Now I've got 2 on my hook. Now we're gonna work a Tunisian simple stitch in the next stitch. So I've got that upside down V. I'm going to work just under that front loop of it. This is just a regular old Tunisian simple stitch, pull up a loop. We've got 3 now. We want to increase once more between our second and third stitches from the previous row. So here I just worked in that upside down V. I'm going to work in the space in between, pull up a loop. Now we've got 4 loops, and then where my stitch marker is marking our last stitch of this row. So I'm going to work into that and pull up a loop. So we should have 5 loops on our hook now. I'm gonna take this stitch marker out for just a second. If this feels intimidating because you haven't had a lot of Tunisian practice, my suggestion would be just stick your hook in where you can find a spot and pull up a loop. You want to have 5 loops on your hook. All of this will become a lot easier to see as we have a few more stitches. So don't worry too much about exactly how this is working. You can always make this in like 5 minutes and then come back and assess how you think everything's looking. Always tear it out if you want, but really it's gonna get easier the more stitches we have. So here we go. I'm pulling through that one with a chain right there. So that is our spot for our stitch marker. It's gonna mark the end of the row next time. And the rest of our return pass, I'm just yarning over, pulling through the first 2, the next 2, the next 2, and the next 2. All right. Again, we're going to increase twice, and that is now always going to happen between the first and second stitch. So right there in that gap, and the second and third stitch. So right in that gap. So to begin, I want to insert my hook in there, pull up a loop. That's my increase. And then I want to work as normal Tunisian simple stitch into the next stitch. And then once again, I want to increase in that next space right there, pop my hook in and pull up a loop. So now we've skipped kind of that first stitch because we already had a loop on there. Then we've increased, worked a Tunisian simple stitch, and increased. And then at this point, we have 3 stitches left in our project. We've got 1, 2, and then the one that the stitch marker is in. So I'm just going to Tunisian simple stitch in the next stitch. This point, we've got 5 loops on our hook. And now from now on, we are always going to decrease at the end of the row. So a decrease is kind of the opposite of what we did over here. We added a loop. Here we're going to eliminate a loop. And it's very easy. We just going to insert our hook under the loop of the next stitch and then also insert our hook through. I like to work kind of through the bars of our last stitch. So now I've got both of those last 2 stitches worked through, and I'm going to yarn over and pull through both of them. So if you've worked a decrease in standard crochet before, it's often like you're just single crocheting 2 together. This is the same thing. You're just Tunisian simple stitch 2 together. At this point, now we have 6 loops on our hook. So for this first section of the scarf, we're always increasing 1 loop with each row. We used to have 5, now we have 6. We're going to do that chain 1 for our return pass. I'm just gonna put this stitch marker into our chain there to mark at the end of the row. And then yarn over and pull through on each of these stitches. It's a little fiddly at first, I'll admit. Don't get discouraged. It is going to get so much easier after you have a few inches of fabric. So I realize this looks like nothing, or maybe it looks like just a pile of mistakes. Just keep going. I promise it'll get easier. We're back here at the beginning. Again, we want to increase twice. So I'm holding the first stitch in my thumb here. We're going to work in between that first and second stitch right there with an increase. Then we're going to Tunisian simple stitch in the next stitch and then work another increase between the second and third stitch. So that looks like just putting my hook between those 2 stitches, pulling up a loop. I'm making sure when I do this that I don't let that first loop on my hook get too loosey-goosey. It has a tendency to get kind of stretched out. So I'm just holding it. I just want it to be fairly even with the rest of them. So I picked that up. Now I can Tunisian simple stitch in my second stitch of the previous row. And again, we're going to increase by working between the next 2 stitches. At this point, we should have 4 loops on our hook, and then Tunisian simple stitch in the next stitch and the next stitch until we only have 2 stitches left to work. So because these are such short rows, happens pretty quick. At this point, I've got my 1 stitch here and then my last stitch with my marker in it. So I'm going to do that decrease where we work under this bar, and then I'll take this out so that you can see a little bit better. This is my last stitch right here. So I like to just kind of work under those 2 columns. And I want to pull the loop that I just yarned over through the stitch I went under first and my last stitch. So I'm combining those and I'm only creating 1 loop. So that is my decrease. Let's count. We should have 7 at this point because we had 6 in the last one. We've got 3 here, 4 here. So we're good on 7. We're increasing by 1 per row. All right, yarn over, do that chain 1, put the stitch marker in there, and then complete my return pass with just yarn over and pull through 2, yarn over and pull through 2. We're just going to do this until we get back to the beginning of the row. Now this is the point at which I would consider adding in my second color if I was making a scarf like that. I'm going to keep showing you how we continue to increase just to not add any more confusion. But if you're interested in adding a second color, my suggestion would be watch the next couple minutes, maybe even practice a little bit. It's really helpful to get a couple inches here before you introduce another strand of yarn. So I'm just going to work a couple more of these and then we'll talk about how to add another color if you're interested. All right, again, 2 increases at the beginning of the row. So that is putting my hook between the first 2 stitches, pulling up a loop, working under the next stitch, just a regular Tunisian simple stitch. Then between the second and third stitches, we're going to pull up a loop. Now we've got 4. Which means we've done our increasing and we're ready to just Tunisian simple stitch across the row until we have 2 stitches remaining. So again, these rows are so short, so I've only got 3 quick stitches until I have 2 left. You can see here without my stitch marker in, it's a little hard to tell where the row ends if you're less familiar with Tunisian crochet. So that's why I suggest putting that stitch marker in there. And after a while, you won't need to keep doing that. You'll start to understand where the row ends and you can stop moving your stitch marker up. But for now, I'm going to work under this loop and then in my last stitch, again, I like to just work under those 2 bars, pull my loop through both of those so that I'm decreasing, turning it into 1 stitch. At this point, we should have 8 loops on our hook because we are adding 1 per row. Again, chain 1, that's where we'll put our stitch marker, and then yarn over and pull through, yarn over and pull through. You are going to come to love these return passes. They are so smooth and relaxing. It's just the best part of Tunisian crochet in my opinion. And especially as these rows get longer, you're just gonna feel like a little yarn surfer as you go back on your return passes. All right, again, we're going to work between the first 2 stitches, pull up a loop, Tunisian simple stitch in the next one, and then pull up a loop between the next 2 stitches, and then we're just going to simple stitch, which just means we're working under that front bar, pulling up a loop until we have 2 stitches remaining in the row. All right, there we are. They're still pretty short rows. I am going to work under this bar and then into my last stitch. Yarn over and pull through both of those. All right, we should have 9 loops here. 2, 4, 6, 8, 9. Okay, I am noticing that mine is getting tighter than I would want it to be. I think I'm a little focused because I'm recording this. If you're noticing this is the case, you want to really deliberately pull your strands of yarn up as you're picking them up on your forward pass. So I am going to do a return pass and then show you what I mean, because we did increase our hook size, but that doesn't do any good if our stitches are still really sort of tacked down on our hook. We want to keep this loose because this stitch has a tendency to curl, and looser stitches are less curly in Tunisian. So I'm once again gonna mark that last stitch, and then as I go back in my forward pass, I'll show you what I mean by picking my loops up a little higher. So my first increase is like this. I'm just gonna lift it a little bit like that. I just don't want them getting too tight on my hook. And regardless of what length of hook you're using, anything like that, you can do the same thing here. Again, I'm going to increase. All right, now I can feel that these are moving a little easier on the hook. This is gonna create a much better tension. I really want this scarf to have nice drape and not be curlier than it needs to be. It is normal to have this curl a bit though. You're definitely going to see yours curling a little, and that is okay because we're going to add a border and block our scarves at the end, which is going to do a lot to reduce the curl. But one of the things you want to do as you're crocheting is just make sure those stitches are nice and loose, which is why we're using these big hooks. All right, I worked under my second to last stitch. I'm going to work in my last stitch, pull my yarn through both. I think at this point we're getting enough of a hang of this to talk about how we would add a second color. As I mentioned, you can do this whenever you feel ready. So in this case, if you're just getting the hang of this, I would work a couple more inches like this before you introduce that other color, mostly just because it's easier to learn one thing at a time. If you're really experienced in Tunisian crochet, you can start adding that second color in your second or third row. The idea here though is we're going to create a woven look by doing something with our return passes is when we're going to introduce this second color of yarn, and then we're going to keep both colors attached until you don't want two colors anymore. So in that green and pink sample, I picked up the pink as my second color, used it for several inches, and then fastened off, and then carried on with my green yarn in a solid color for a while. So it is totally up to you. That's why you can really use any yarn in your stash, make this any look you want. It's really easy once you understand how this concept works. So what I'm doing here, I'm just pulling my new yarn through to do that chain one, just like I would any other time. And I'm just using a different color. So my light pink is going to be my second color here. Now I am going to pop that stitch marker in here so I remember where my last stitch is. And then it can be helpful to hold on to the strand of your first color like this, just so that that loop doesn't get too loose, but you can always tighten it up again later. So I'm just going to hold it in my hand like this, and then I'm going to work my return pass using this new color. So I've already done my chain one. Now I can just yarn over and pull through two, yarn over and pull through two, yarn over, pull through two. Again, we're doing that all the way across. This really doesn't look like much, but it's such a cool effect once you get a few rows in. All right, so I've done my return pass with my new color, and now I'm going to do a forward pass using my new color. So that means I've got to increase right away, simple stitch in my next stitch, increase again right away. Okay, now my increases are complete. I'm just simple stitching across this row, letting those loops come up a little higher than I was before. It's a lot to keep track of on camera, I'm not gonna lie. All right, I've worked into all my stitches here and I've got two remaining. It's super clear to see because they're both that first color. So now I'm going to decrease by working under the first one, working into that last stitch of the row right here, and yarning over and pulling through both of those. All right, so now we've decreased. Still doesn't look like very much, but if you were to flip this over, you would see that now there is a stripe in my second color. So when this becomes really cool is when we start to stack multiple of these on top of each other. So now I'm going to switch back to my first color, and this is looking a little fiddly, I realize, but it's really easy once you get the hang of it, and you're not even going to think twice about switching back and forth between colors. So I'm going to pop this out and use my first color here to do that chain one and put my stitch marker in. There's really not a lot to think about as you're doing this with the colors. The main idea is that you're picking up a new color for your return passes and then carrying it back for your next forward pass. So I just did my chain one with my new color. Again, I may choose to kind of pull this gently. You don't have to pull it very far, but I'm dropping that color for now, so it could get a little loose. All right, I've already done my chain one, so now I'm going to yarn over and pull through two, just like that, to work my return pass using my first color again. Now that return pass is complete, we're going to use the same color to work our next forward pass. Increase, simple stitch, increase, and then simple stitch across the row until we have 2 stitches remaining. Here we are with our 2 stitches remaining, so I'm going to work under the second to last one and then kind of through the last one, pull up a loop. There we go. We've turned those 2 stitches into 1 stitch. And now we're going to switch to color number 2. So at every return pass, we're going to pick up our new color. As I carry this up, you're going to start to see it just move along the side of your work like this. That is totally fine. You don't want this to be super loose or super tight. Super tight will change the shape of the edge of your scarf, and too loose will sort of make it harder to work over with your border. So you just kind of want just sort of normal tension on that. I've chained 1 with just simply by picking that up, so I can go ahead and put that stitch marker in there and then yarn over and pull through 2. Pull through 2. And like I said, we're going to work a border around this to help combat that curl. And so just carrying a yarn up the side, it's really not very visible anyhow, but it's going to get disguised even further when we work the border around the entire scarf. Now with our lighter pink, the second color, again, I'm going to work a forward pass. I think you're probably getting the idea at this point. We're working our return pass with a color, and then the next forward pass, and then we switch colors at the return pass step. So because I'm right-handed, that means I'm always switching colors on the left side of my project. If you're left-handed, that color change is always going to happen over here on the right side of your project. At the end of this row, I'm working under my second to last stitch, through my last stitch there, working under both of those so I can turn that into 1 stitch. And we're starting to see just the slightest hint of this woven look here. Again, it's just not very clear yet because we haven't worked that many rows. If I turn this over, you can also start to see how we're adding stripes. I want to show you the potential of this technique though, because as you work more rows where you're switching colors at the end for every return pass, you can create these gorgeous stripes. In this case, this sample is made with Lion Brand Ferris wheel. So this is a naturally self-striping yarn. I definitely didn't add all of these colors in here. It just does the work for you. And then I alternated that with this color theory yarn. So these are the same weight, and that is essential as you're choosing 2 yarns to combine. In this case, they're the same weight. They really are a very similar thickness. And I just picked up this. I started using this yarn, and then I picked up this, and I alternated rows back and forth of these 2 yarns. And the result is these beautiful sort of gradient stripes on this side. And then on the other side, you'll see there is this woven look that again shows the gradient. It just looks completely different. And I love that this is reversible, because you really do get 2 different looks. This one I think looks a lot like knit stockinette, and then this one almost looks woven. It's really so beautiful and very different than most other looks that we create with standard crochet stitches. This is the look you can create if you use 2 solid yarns together. So instead of having a self-striping yarn, I added this pink as the second color and just worked it in a portion of the scarf. So as you get over here, it's all solid, but this pink is just worked every other row as I just demonstrated, and so it looks woven on this side, and then if you flip it over, it creates these really pretty natural stripes with 0 effort. So that's my favorite kind of stripe, or anything else, the low effort type. So if you're considering adding another color, there's really endless possibilities in how you do it. Whether you use one main color, like you could use green for the background and then pick up a new color every few inches. In this case, I only used pink, but if you have a lot of scraps, it's really cool to add stripes of different colors. Of course, the self-striping yarn is totally the cheat code. Then you don't even have to have any extra ends to weave in. All right, now that we've probably gotten excited to try a bunch of different color combinations, I am actually going to tear the second color out because I would like this little neckerchief to be a solid color. So what's so cool about Tunisian crochet versus knitting is that you can really just pull it out without things getting out of control and dropping a bunch of stitches. So just like this, I've got my stitch marker in there, but I'm pulling out these rows. If you find yourself making a mistake that you just can't live with, this is how you'll pull out your rows. And you always want to stop at the beginning of a forward pass like this. It becomes a lot easier than to pick up your loops. Then you just pop your hook in there and start working back in this direction like nothing ever happened. In this case though, I want to eliminate that second color. So I'm just gonna do this, pull it out like this, and because it does get a little trickier to pick up these loops, I'm just gonna take this out so I can start at the beginning of a forward pass right here. And just like that, I've caught up using one solid color here, and I want to give you a little sense of where we're headed with this. So I know right now it just almost looks like a little shrimp or something, but if I rotate this in this direction, we start to see our boomerang shape coming together. So this here will become, if I was putting this maybe on a Barbie or something, this is one corner of the scarf, here's another corner of the scarf, and this would be the part that's pointing down toward the belly button. So this is not going to change as we crochet. The same sort of geometry is going to be true the bigger and bigger this gets, which means that the more rows we crochet with this little increase over on this side as we begin, I'll rotate it here so that we can kind of get our bearings again. We're increasing over here 2, then we're decreasing over here. So what that means is this is going to continue to get longer and longer, and that is also going to take us in this direction. So what we want to do is continue increasing twice at the beginning of the row, decreasing once at the end of the row in every single row until you have a width right here that you like. And what I mean by that is that you want to look at this measurement right here. If this was on Barbie right here, we want to get to a point where we're happy with the height of the scarf. So the measurement from where it would be right here under her chin to her belly button. When that is looking good to you, I definitely recommend just holding it up to your own body and determining how deep you want this shawl to be. Right here, that's when we're gonna move on to the next step, which is gonna be just a slight variation on what we've done this far. So if I was making this for Barbie and I wanted to stop right here because I felt like this was deep enough, I would move on to the second step in this pattern. But for most of us who are not Barbie size, we want this to get a lot deeper. So we're going to continue in rows just as we have been with 2 increases at the beginning and then that decrease at the other side, and we're just going to continue like that until you have the depth of the scarf that you're looking for. All right, progress has been made here. My little shrimp is getting a bit bigger, and I wanted to pause for a moment and just point out something. If you do want to create this woven look, as in this green and pink sample here, there's one thing that I want to call out. This is up to you if you decide this is important, but as you're finishing off your stripe color, so for me that's this pink color here, if you want to move into a solid like I did, I found that the cleanest look of the stripes right here was to complete a return pass with my second color, so that's my pink, and then I actually fastened it off right here so that instead of going back with pink like I typically would, normally I would go one return pass and then a forward pass and then I would switch to my next color. But the struggle with that is it creates a slightly uneven striped look. There's one skinny stripe of your second color then. So that is totally fine. It's such a minor detail, but I really wanted this to be fully reversible and I wanted my stripes to look consistent. So the way to get around that is when you are on your final return pass of your accent color, then you're just gonna fasten it off at the end of that return pass. Because I'm right-handed, that means it happened on my right-hand side. If you were left-handed, your return pass would end up right over here on the left. And then you would fasten off your original color of yarn over here, and you just start your next forward pass with color A or color 1. So all that means is that we're breaking out of our pattern just slightly at the end. Instead of doing a return pass and a forward pass in that accent color, we're stopping after our return pass and then picking up our original color to do our next forward pass and then all the rest of them. In the case of this scarf, I just use solid green after that. So I hope that that makes sense. If it feels like a little too complicated, or if you just want to continue using an accent color, then don't worry about this. Also, if it really doesn't matter to you if you have one thin stripe back here, also don't worry about it. This is just one of those like kind of picky details of the sort of stuff that I think about in my projects. So I wanted to inform you. If it's too complicated for you, forget everything I just said and keep carrying along, cruising with your increasing, 2 increases on your beginning of your forward pass and then a decrease at the end of it. You're gonna keep cruising like that until you're happy with the depth of your scarf. So let's go back to our original sample here, the smaller neckerchief, and I am ready to measure the depth of my scarf and see if it's sort of the thickness that I want. So I'm gonna rotate it like this. Again, now maybe it's a little big for a Barbie, maybe it would fit an American Girl doll or something like that. So I just wanna show you here, this is about 5 inches, just shy of 5 inches, which means that the thickness of my scarf, how kind of wide it is or deep it is, however you want to count that measurement, is going to be about 5 inches. So I feel good about that, especially because I want to be able to continue using this standard hook. And so I can't get too many stitches on there before it starts to feel a little out of control. So at this point, I'm going to move on to stage 2 of the pattern. But of course, 5 inches is really only enough for quite a shallow little neckerchief. But if what you actually want is more of a shawl or a thicker scarf, you can see this sample is actually about 15 inches, so 3 times. So that just means that I continued increasing as we've done so far, 2 increases over here, 1 decrease over here. I just continue that for longer, and that's what got me to this depth. That's about 15 inches. In any case, when you have reached a depth that you're happy with the length from your chin toward your belly button, then you're ready to move on to part 2. In part 2 of the pattern, we are going to continue doing the same thing we've done all along with 2 increases at the beginning of our forward pass, but then at the end of each forward pass, instead of doing 1 decrease, we're actually going to do 2 decreases. And that is what's going to enable our scarf to, instead of being just a pointy triangle scarf, it's going to have a little bit more of a sloped curve like this. So if you didn't want to do that, you just carry on how we've been doing. When you have a piece of fabric that's the size you want, your scarf's done. That is also a fine way to do it, but in order to create more of that crescent shape that's going to curve like this, we are going to begin decreasing twice at the end of each forward pass. So what I like to do now is just leave that stitch marker I've had at the end of my rows. I'm just going to leave that there so that mentally I know where I transitioned to part 2 of the pattern. And then I'm going to use a different stitch marker right here to mark the ends of my row. This becomes especially important as we start part 2 of the pattern because it's going to start to slope a little bit, and recognizing the end of the row becomes a little trickier. So even if you're more experienced at Tunisian crochet, I find this to be a super helpful little tip for working part 2. All right, so the way that we do this, we're starting the row just as we have all our other rows with an increase right away, picking up that loop, and then a simple stitch in the next stitch, and then another increase between the second and third stitch. So now I've got 4 stitches, and now we're just going to simple stitch across the row, just like we've done this whole time. Previously, we were stopping when we had 2 stitches left so that we could do that decrease. Now we're gonna work across the row and stop when we have 4 stitches left. And having 4 stitches left will look something like this. I've got that 1, 2, 3, I've got those vertical bars, and then my last stitch, which usually we have a stitch marker in. I took it out so that I can show you what I'm talking about here, but we're going to decrease these 2 stitches, we're gonna crochet them together, and then just as we've done all along, we're gonna crochet those 2 together. So it's the same process for both decreases, working under 1 bar, and then the next bar, then yarning over and pulling up a loop through both of them. So we've decreased 1, and then again, I'm going to work under this bar and then through that last stitch. I like to work through under both bars of it like this, and then pull my yarn through both of those. So we've taken 4 stitches and we've turned them into 2 loops on our hook, thereby decreasing 2 stitches. So when we're doing all of these rows in part 2, our stitch count is not changing because now we're increasing twice at the beginning and then decreasing twice at the end. So our stitch count is going to remain even. And when we work that return pass, I'm yarning over that chain 1, and then I'm going to start working through 2 loops at a time, just as we've done all along. And I'm going to pop my stitch marker in here. This is my reminder of where my last stitch is. Because we're sloping, it can become really hard to identify that. So I highly recommend putting a stitch marker in there at least until you can really clearly identify the end of your row. It also just makes it easier to then count 4 stitches and leave those for your decreases. So if you've been alternating 2 colors to create that woven look or stripes, you're doing the same thing, you're just carrying on with that technique. Now we're just decreasing twice at the end of the row. That is the only thing we're doing differently. Whatever you're doing color-wise, stripes, self-striping yarn, switching colors, whatever it is, I hope you're having fun with it and you're just carrying along just as we have been. And now we're going to work the rest of the pattern just like this. So that means, as we've done all along, we start each row with 2 increases. There's my first one, then simple stitch, and then my next increase is worked between the second and third stitch. I've got 4 loops. Now I'm just gonna simple stitch across the row. And then at the end of the row, you're pausing when you have 4 stitches left. So that's that first vertical bar, second, third, and then our last stitch, which is marked right there. So that allows us to crochet these 2 together. I'm working under that first bar, and then the next bar, and then yarning over and pulling through both of those. So that's my first decrease. And then again, under my last bar, and then through my last stitch here. I find it a little tricky when there's a stitch marker in there, so sometimes I take that out first. Then just yarning over and pulling through both of those. And now we have decreased by 2 at the end of the row, increased by 2 over here, so our stitch count hasn't changed. Again, I would move this stitch marker up as you go to keep track of the end of the row. And now your job is just to cruise along in some nice relaxing rows of Tunisian simple stitch with 2 increases over here, 2 decreases over here. And then the way you'll know that you're done with section 2 is that you like the length of your scarf. So it's quite easy because every time you finish a return pass like this, you can pop a stitch marker in your live loop and try your scarf on, and then just keep going until you're happy with the length that you have. At that point, we are ready to bind off. And the way we do that is very similar to a Tunisian simple stitch. So we're not going to increase now because we don't really have to worry about that. We're just going to try to make a clean edge to finish this side of the scarf off. So I'm going to work under not this first stitch because this loop already counts as my first stitch. I'm just working under the next stitch like a Tunisian simple stitch. But instead of simple stitching, I'm going to slip stitch. So I'm not going to hold that second loop on my hook. I'm going to pull it through my first loop. So now, if you've ever knit and done any binding off and knitting, it's very similar. I've bound off that, I've fastened it off, and I'm ready to go under the next stitch. Just insert my hook under that bar, pull my loop up, but instead of keeping it there, we're just gonna pull it through the loop that's already on the hook. Again, work under my bar, pull my loop through, and then slip stitch by pulling it through the loop on the hook. So as I do this, like we've done all along, we just want a really even tension. So I want to make sure that I'm not making this loop super tight, because if I do that and then pull another super tight loop through it, we're going to shorten the width of the side and sort of unnecessarily scrunch it up. So instead, we really just want to keep the same tension we've had all along so that the edging here can kind of fall naturally in line with the tension of our stitches. Similarly, if we did it way too loosely, you would give your piece another reason to curl, which, as we all know with simple stitch, we don't want to do that. We want to combat that curl. So we're just going to work like this, slip stitching across this row until we get to our stitch marker at the end of our forward pass. And then as we come upon the end of this forward pass here, I've got one more bar to work under and slip stitch, and then my last spot right here, I'm going to work into that final stitch, divide it in half like we typically do, and then fasten off right there. But instead of fastening off, I'm going to keep this yarn attached because we're going to use this to crochet all the way around the scarf now and make a few rounds of a border. You may be noticing that your scarf is curling. It's very likely to be quite curly at this point. I've actually already blocked this one once. So that's why it's not looking quite as curly, but yours is probably even more curly than this. And one of the ways that we're going to combat that is by adding a border to weigh down the edges. If you want to use a different color for your border, you're going to want to just attach it here. But if not, you can keep this yarn attached. I like to keep my stitch marker here just so I can kind of stay oriented to where my round ends, but I'm going to move it slightly so I can work into the space of this last stitch. And then we're going to begin crocheting against this edge here. This is where I've been decreasing. So if I were to position this so that we can get a little bit oriented, this is my decrease edge, this is my increase edge, this is the side of the scarf that would go under my chin. And we're just going to start with the right side of our fabric facing. Again, this is reversible because this side really is a cool bumpy texture, but just for clarity, we're going to use our Tunisian simple stitch side facing up for this part. So we've got our space here that is where our last stitch was bound off, and our goal here is to single crochet around the scarf evenly. So I am going to suggest what is working for me, but this is really based on the tension of your rows. So rather than a very prescriptive number of stitches, we're really going to just focus on everything laying flat as we cruise along each edge. And I will say you may want to switch to a smaller hook size here. If you remember, we were using sort of an exaggerated hook size just to get the right tension with our simple stitch. But now that we're just going to work in standard crochet stitches, it's totally fine to go down a couple of hook sizes. I was using a K here, which is a 6.5 millimeter. I'm going to move down to a 5.5 millimeter, so that's an I. That's going down about 1 millimeter. Really, the most important thing here is that we get consistent tension, that it's not too loose, it's not too tight. So I would suggest going down your hook size just slightly, but you don't have to overthink what size that is. I would think more about the tension of how your stitches are looking. All right, with all of that in mind, we are going to crochet along this edge, working under these stitches of our decrease edge. And the way that you divide these stitches up, as far as the bars that you're working under, is really up to you. We're just looking for a nice clean edge here. So what I like to do is work, kind of split this V in half and pick up 2 of those bars and work under those. But again, you really just want to pick a lane and then do the same thing in every row end. So if you want to work under all 3 of them like this, do that and just do that all the way across. That's what's going to make the most clean and consistent looking edge. So I already worked 1 stitch in this sort of corner here, and then I'm just going to single crochet across. And for this particular scarf, I'm going to put 2 single crochet in one row end, and then 1 single crochet in the next row end. Depending on how loose your stitches are in your simple stitch section of the scarf, you might want to put 2 stitches in each row end. You may only want to put 1 stitch in each row end. The real main thing we're looking for here is just a nice smooth edge. So whatever frequency it takes to get to that nice smooth edge, that's what you want to do. I like to pick something and stick with it for a little while and then take a look at how it's coming together. This is maybe even slightly tight. I might tear it out and try again, just compare it to putting 2 stitches in every row end, see if I like that better. You know, I do think that looks a little bit better. So this is now 2 single crochets in each row edge, and I think that's going to lay a bit smoother. It has a nice consistent look. So I'm going to continue like that, 2 single crochets in each row edge. But again, it really has to do with your own tension of the main scarf as well as the tension of your single crochet stitches. So find what works for you. Don't hesitate to try a few stitches like I just did, tear them out if you don't like how it looks, because this part is definitely worth getting right, as it's really going to level up the edges of your scarf. So from here, we're gonna work all the way along this decrease edge, just like this. I still have my stitch marker in here from where I switched from doing 1 decrease to 2 decreases. So this is part 1 in the pattern, and this is part 2. We're gonna work this single crochet border situation all the way till we get to our pointy corner. And then honestly, we're gonna continue it, but I'll meet you here at this corner to talk about what to do next. And as you're working along the edge of part 1 of your scarf here, you may notice that you need fewer single crochet stitches. Just the nature of doing 1 decrease here instead of 2 makes that row edge just slightly shorter, which means that you may want to do 2 stitches in every row edge a couple times, and then just 1 stitch, and then 2 again, maybe twice, and then 1. I would just sort of create some frequency that works to make this lay flat. That's all we're aiming for. And then when you arrive at this corner, we just want to get around this corner in a smooth way. So the way I like to do that is put a couple spots where I do 2 single crochet. We need to kind of round this corner. And we're going to now work into the top edge of the scarf, which was our increased side. So you can see here I just did 2 single crochet, 2 single crochet, and then I'm going to come around right here. I'm just working over this yarn tail. I'll weave it in a little bit later, but it's nice to tuck it in under some single crochet stitches as I go. So from here, we want to continue creating that nice smooth border, so you can decide what works for your scarf, whether that is 2 single crochet in each row edge. These row edges tend to be a little bit more compact than the ones along the bottom on the decrease side, so you probably will need fewer stitches along this edge. So if you were doing 2 stitches per row edge on the bottom edge of the scarf, you may only need 1 up here, or maybe 2 in one row and then 1 in the next, 2 in one in the next. But we just want it to sort of fall in place and really not draw attention to itself. So another way we can do that is just make sure we're consistently working under whatever loops we choose to work under on this row edge. We want to do it the same each time. So as I did on the bottom, I'm going to pick up 2 loops here and just work under that. I've also done this where I've worked under the whole stitch like this, and that creates a nice kind of eyelet along this edge. So either way works. Just kind of pick a lane and stick to it, and we're going to work all the way across this increase edge of the scarf. And then at the completion of that increase side, all that we have left for our first border round is to work into the stitches that we just fastened off. So it's our last little side. My stitch marker is still here marking the last stitch of that forward pass row, so I can know exactly where my round of single crochet ends here. And just like we did in the previous scarf corner, we just want to make sure we're putting enough stitches here to kind of round the corner without causing it to curl up. So I'm going to put 2 stitches in each of these corner stitches. Kind of, I always think of like a race car rounding the racetrack here. We got to stay on the track without falling off. So I've got 2 stitches. I did 2 stitches in 3 of the corner spots right here so that I can cruise around that corner. And now the most obvious thing would be to single crochet in each of your stitches, although I will say that these Tunisian stitches can be a little bit more narrow than your single crochet stitches. So you might find that as you're going along, you just want to skip over one of these stitches. If you're finding that you're getting too many single crochet stitches and it's feeling like you almost have like a little bit, it's too dense there, it's starting to ripple a little, I would just skip over one of these bound off stitches periodically to make sure that this round ends in a flat way. And we're just going to continue like this until we get to that stitch marker that indicates the beginning of where we started. And then as we come upon our first single crochet, we're just going to slip stitch into it to finish this round off. Now we're going to turn and work a round of single crochet in the opposite direction. So we want the bumpy side of our scarf facing. So I chained 1, I'm going to flip it around this way, and then just single crochet in each stitch all the way around the scarf. You may find that when you get to these sharper corners here, you need to add a couple extra stitches, maybe 2 single crochet in one of the stitches, 2 single crochet in another, maybe 2 single crochet a third time, just to work around that corner. It kind of depends on the size of your scarf and how loose your stitches are. But often when we're working around a corner in crochet, we need to add a couple of stitches just to get around that smoothly without sort of artificially tightening the border down. So that's the only thing that you have to pay attention to as you go, increasing a little bit around the corner, but other than that, you're just working around the entire triangle in single crochet. And at the end of that second round, we'll just work under our first stitch, slip stitch to join it. And at this point, you have a couple of options. You can be done with your borders here, or you can add a third or even a fourth and a fifth round, however you like. One option would be to work another single crochet round, just now with the right side facing, heading back in the opposite direction, and add just one more round of single crochet, just like we've been doing. Another option is to work a final round of reverse single crochet. So that is also known as the crab stitch, and that's what's on this green sample here. So it creates this nice sort of delicate but kind of understated finished edge. I always feel like if you don't know what to do with the edges of your projects, you can't really go wrong with reverse single crochet. It's a really good go-to. So I will show you how to do that now, but don't feel limited by that. If you want to add scallops or peacoats or anything else, this is the time to do it, to really make your scarf your own. So to get oriented here, I just finished this round of single crochet. I'm going to chain one, and then we're gonna turn around. We want the right side of our project facing as we reverse single crochet, but what is so funny about this stitch is, as it sounds, we're gonna work in the opposite direction we normally do. So because I'm right-handed, typically I would head in this direction and work counterclockwise around the scarf. But in reverse single crochet, we're gonna work clockwise in this direction. If you're left-handed, you are gonna go this way and work counterclockwise. So it feels a little bit weird at first, but it definitely becomes easier as you do it. I'm just getting started moving my stitch over. So I just did my first reverse single crochet. I'll show you now how I did that. So all you do is insert your hook in the next stitch just as you would with a single crochet, yarn over and pull up a loop. This is all very similar to how we typically single crochet, but we're just doing it backwards. So now I've got 2 loops on my hook, yarn over and pull through those 2. So you can see they get a little bit twisty, and that's how we create that nice edging look that looks almost like a ribbon has been twisted around the project. So now I insert my hook in the next stitch, pull up a loop. We've got 2. They're intentionally twisted there on the hook, yarn over and pull through those. Again, tension matters when you're doing this, and you just want to be consistent as you go. If your stitches get really tall like this, you're going to end up with a much looser border like that. It's going to be just kind of more exaggerated. I like to make sure they stay the same size by just having some awareness of how loose the loop is on my hook. So as I insert in the next stitch, pull up 2 loops, check the tension there, yarn over and pull through both of those. So if you like this look, you would just want to continue in reverse single crochet or crab stitch, whatever you want to call it, all the way around your scarf. So working into each stitch as you go. And then this is one of those borders that this is your final round. You only do this when you're ready to finish it off. And when you've worked all the way around, then one of the ways I like to finish off my round of reverse single crochet is just insert my hook under that first stitch of the round and then just pull my loop through. I'm aiming for just the most consistent sort of invisible join right there, and sometimes I think that that looks the cleanest. I also just want to celebrate with you that I just won a game of yarn chicken. This is all that's left of my entire ball, so it's a good thing I didn't try to make my scarf any larger. From here we can fasten off whatever you do for your third round, or however many border rounds you do. When you're all finished, fasten off, and now it's time to talk about blocking, which is one of the main steps that we'll take to reduce the curl of your scarf. While you can get away with not blocking some of your crochet projects, anything that is made with one of the more curly Tunisian crochet stitches really has to be blocked. Don't skip this step or you're just going to constantly be irritated by how it's curling. But I promise blocking is worth it because it is the last and final way to sort of reduce any curling that you're seeing in your finished project. So I have a blocking mat here. This is not essential, although I will say you do need to be able to pin your project down. So one way I've worked around this before is just laying a towel on the carpet and then poking my pins into the rug pad. I am not saying you should try this. It may ruin your carpet. I don't know, but it's just a way that I've done it. Please try it at your own risk if you don't have a blocking pad. But the idea here is to use a T-pin like this, and we're just going to insert them around the project to really hold it in place in the way we want it to be shaped when it is finished. So for this, I want to put my pins fairly frequently, and because it has this curved edge, I'm going to stretch it out just slightly. We really don't want to be stingy with the pins. We want to put a lot in there because what you want to avoid is stretching it. Let's say I'm exaggerating this, but let's say I stretched it like that and then I blocked it. It would end up with this little point right here. So we don't want to do that. We want a really nice smooth line. So I'm going to pin that here and put another pin right here so that I can stretch it out and really create that consistent edge. You also don't have to have a steamer like this. This is quite inexpensive. It's maybe around $20 on Amazon, but you can also use an iron that has steam functionality. The main idea here is that we're trying to direct some moisture and some heat at our yarn. And I do want to offer the caveat that depending on the fiber type you're using, you may want a different method of blocking, but steam blocking is generally my go-to. You always want to take care not to touch the hot element to the yarn though, especially if you have any sort of acrylic or man-made fiber, because it will melt it. So in this case, I don't have man-made fiber. This is wool, but I'm still going to be just directing the steam right here at my yarn without actually touching it to the project. And then I'm going to direct steam at my project, specifically focusing on the edges, because of course that is the part we're really trying to train to lay flat. So I'm directing my steam at that. I'm a few inches away from the yarn. Again, you want to check what your fiber type is to know the best way to block it, but this is kind of the basic method for steam blocking. I do want to aim steam at the entire project, but the focus is on these edges that I want to lay flat. And this is not the time to underdo it. Some projects you can just shoot a bit of steam at them and call it a day. This is not that. You really want to really go around your project a couple times, focusing on the edges, because that's what's going to convince them to lay as flat as possible. And then if you have the time, I suggest leaving this pinned down to your blocking board or wherever you have it for maybe even 24 hours, definitely overnight or as long as it takes for your project to totally dry. But if you can keep it pinned down for a little bit longer, withhold a little bit of excitement to just take it off and try it on or use it, I highly recommend that, because that just gives the stitches a little bit more time to settle into place after receiving this water and heat situation. And I do want to say, in a particularly large scarf, you may have to get a little bit creative about how you pin the entire thing down. You can see with the larger green scarf, I did have to pin it to my rug a little bit, which actually worked fine, and it allowed me to get the whole thing blocked in one big solid piece. I hope you love how your new scarf project turned out and that you're already planning your next versions. Please come share a photo of your project in the Make and Do Crew community. We would love to admire your stitches and chat with you about all things crochet. Until next time, happy crocheting!